Section 8 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. A Tale of a Tub. The learned Aeolists maintain the original cause of all things to be wind, from which principle this whole universe was at first produced, and into which it must at last be resolved, that the same breath which had kindled and blew up the flame of nature should one day blow it out. Quod procul a nobis flectat fortuna gubernans. This is what the Adepti understand by their anima mundi, that is to say, the spirit, or breath, or wind of the world, or examine the whole system by the particulars of nature, and you will find it not to be disputed. For whether you please to call the forma informans of man by the name of spiritus, animus, afflatus, or anima, what are all these but several appellations for wind, which is the ruling element in every compound, and into which they will resolve upon their corruption? Further, what is life itself but, as it is commonly called, the breath of our nostrils? Whence it is very justly observed by naturalists that wind still continues of great emolument in certain mysteries not to be named, giving occasion for those happy epithets of turgidus and inflatus applied either to the emittent or recipient organs. By what I have gathered out of ancient records, I find the compass of their doctrine took in 32 points, wherein it would be tedious to be very particular. However, a few of their most important precepts, deducible from it, are by no means to be omitted, among which the following maxim was of much weight: that since wind had the master share as well as operation in every compound, by consequence those beings must be of chief excellence wherein that primordium appears most prominently to abound, and therefore man is in highest perfection of all created things, as having by the great bounty of philosophers been endued with three distinct animas or winds, to which the sage Aeolists with much liberality have added a fourth, of equal necessity as well as ornament with the other three, by this quartum principium taking in the four corners of the world, which gave occasion to that renowned Kabbalist Bombastus of placing the body of man in due position to the four cardinal points. In consequence of this, their next principle was that man brings with him into the world a peculiar portion or grain of wind, which may be called a quinta essentia, extracted from the other four. This quintessence is of Catholic use upon all emergencies of life, is improvable into all arts and sciences, and may be wonderfully refined as well as enlarged by certain methods in education. This, when blown up to its perfection, ought not to be covetously boarded up, stifled, or hid under a bushel, but freely communicated to mankind. Upon these reasons, and others of equal weight, the wise Aeolists affirm the gift of belching to be the noblest act of a rational creature, to cultivate which art and render it more serviceable to mankind, they made use of several methods. At certain seasons of the year you might behold the priests amongst them in vast numbers, with their mouths gaping wide against a storm. At other times were to be seen several hundreds linked together in a circular chain, with every man a pair of bellows applied to his neighbour, by which they blew up each other to the shape and size of a tun, and for that reason, with great propriety of speech, did usually call their bodies their vessels. When by these and the like performances they were grown sufficiently replete, they would immediately depart, and disembogue for the public good a plentiful share of their acquirements into their disciples' chaps. For we must here observe that all learning was esteemed among them to be compounded from the same principle, because first it is generally affirmed or confessed that learning puffeth men up, and secondly they proved it by the following syllogism: words are but wind, and nothing is nothing but words, ergo learning is nothing but wind. For this reason the philosophers among them did in their schools deliver to their pupils all their doctrines and opinions by eructation, wherein they had acquired a wonderful eloquence, and of incredible variety. But the great characteristic by which their chief sages were best distinguished was a certain position of countenance, which gave undoubted intelligence to what degree or proportion the spirit agitated the inward mass. For after certain gripings, the wind and vapours issuing forth, having first by their turbulence and convulsions within caused an earthquake in man's little world, distorted the mouth, bloated the cheeks, and gave the eyes a terrible kind of relievo, at which junctures all their belches were received for sacred, the sourer the better, and swallowed with infinite consolation by their meagre devotees. And to render these yet more complete, because the breath of man's life is in his nostrils, therefore the choicest, most edifying, and most enlivening belches were very wisely conveyed through that vehicle to give them a tincture as they passed. Their gods were the four winds, whom they worshipped as the spirits that pervade and enliven the universe, and as those from whom alone all inspiration can properly be said to proceed. However, the chief of these, to whom they performed the adoration of latria, was the almighty North, an ancient deity whom the inhabitants of Megalopolis in Greece had likewise in highest reverence. Omnium deorum Boream maxime celebrant. This god, though endued with ubiquity, was yet supposed by the profounder Aeolists to possess one peculiar habitation, or, to speak in form, a caelum empyreum, wherein he was more intimately present. This was situated in a certain region well known to the ancient Greeks, by them called the Land of Darkness, and although many controversies have arisen upon that matter, yet so much is undisputed, that from a region of the like denomination the most refined Aeolists have borrowed their original, from whence in every age the zealous among their priesthood have brought over their choicest inspiration, fetching it with their own hands from the fountainhead in certain bladders, and disploding it among the sectaries in all nations, who did, and do, and ever will, daily gasp and pant after it. Now their mysteries and rites were performed in this manner. It is well known among the learned that the virtuosos of former ages had a contrivance for carrying and preserving winds in casks or barrels, which was of great assistance upon long sea voyages, and the loss of so useful an art at present is very much to be lamented, though I know not how, with great negligence omitted by Pancyrillus. It was an invention ascribed to Aeolus himself, from which this sect is denominated, and who, in honour of their founder's memory, have to this day preserved great numbers of those barrels, whereof they fix one in each of their temples, first beating up the top. Into this barrel upon solemn days the priest enters, where, having before duly prepared himself, by the methods already described, a secret funnel is also conveyed to the bottom of the barrel, which admits new supplies of inspiration from a northern chink or cranny, whereupon you behold him swell immediately to the shape and size of his vessel. In this posture he disembogues whole tempests upon his auditory, as the spirit from beneath gives him utterance, which, issuing ex aditis and penetralibus, is not performed without much pain and griping. And the wind, in breaking forth, deals with his face as it does with that of the sea, first blackening, then wrinkling, and at last bursting it into a foam. It is in this guise the sacred Aeolus delivers his oracular belches to his panting disciples, of whom some are greedily gaping after the sanctified breath, others are all the while hymning out the praises of the winds, and gently wafted to and fro by their own humming, do thus represent the soft breezes of their deities appeased. It is from this custom of the priests that some authors maintain these Aeolists to have been very ancient in the world, because the delivery of their mysteries, which I have just now mentioned, appears exactly the same with that of other ancient oracles, whose inspirations were owing to certain subterraneous effluviums of wind, delivered with the same pain to the priest, and much about the same influence on the people. It is true indeed that these were frequently managed and directed by female officers, whose organs were understood to be better disposed for the admission of those oracular gusts, as entering and passing up through a receptacle of greater capacity, and causing also a pruriency by the way, such as with due management has been refined from carnal into a spiritual ecstasy. And to strengthen this profound conjecture, it is further insisted that this custom of female priests is kept up still in certain refined colleges of our modern Aeolists, who are agreed to receive their inspiration derived through the receptacle aforesaid, like their ancestors the Sibylls. And whereas the mind of man, when he gives the spur and bridle to his thoughts, does never stop, but naturally sallies out into both extremes of high and low, of good and evil, has first flight of fancy commonly transports him to ideas of what is most perfect, finished, and exalted, till, having soared out of his own reach and sight, not well perceiving how near the frontiers of height and depth border upon each other, with the same course and wing he falls down plump into the lowest bottom of things, like one who travels the east into the west, or like a straight line drawn by its own length into a circle. Whether a tincture of malice in our natures makes us fond of furnishing every bright idea with its reverse, or whether reason, reflecting upon the sum of things, can, like the sun, serve only to enlighten one half of the globe, leaving the other half by necessity under shade and darkness, or whether fancy, flying up to the imagination of what is highest and best, becomes overshort and spent and weary, and suddenly falls, like a dead bird of paradise, to the ground, or whether, after all these metaphysical conjectures, I have not entirely missed the true reason. The proposition, however, which has stood me in so much circumstance is altogether true, that as the most uncivilized parts of mankind have some way or other climbed up into the conception of a God or supreme power, so they have seldom forgot to provide their fears with certain ghastly notions, which instead of better have served them pretty tolerably for a devil. And this proceeding seems to be natural enough, for it is with men whose imaginations are lifted up very high after the same rate as with those whose bodies are so, that is, they are delighted with the advantage of a nearer contemplation upwards, so they are equally terrified with the dismal prospect of the precipice below. Thus in the choice of a devil, it has been the usual method of mankind to single out some being, either in act or in vision, which is in most antipathy to the God they had framed. Thus also the sect of the Aeolists possessed themselves with a dread and horror and hatred of two malignant natures, betwixt whom and the deities they adored perpetual enmity was established. The first of these was the chameleon, sworn foe to inspiration, who in scorn devoured large influences of their god, without refunding the smallest blast by eructation. The other was a huge terrible monster called Moulinavent, who with 4 strong arms waged eternal battle with all their divinities, dexterously turning to avoid their blows and repay them with interest. Thus furnished and set out with gods as well as devils was the renowned sect of Aeolists, which makes at this day so illustrious a figure in the world, and whereof that polite nation of Laplanders are beyond all doubt a most authentic branch, of whom I therefore cannot without injustice here omit to make honourable mention, since they appear to be so closely allied in point of interest as well as inclinations with their brother Aeolists among us, as not only to buy their winds by wholesale from the same merchants, but also to retail them after the same rate and method, and to customers much alike. Now whether the system here delivered was wholly compiled by Jack, or, as some writers believe, rather copied from the original at Delphos, with certain additions and emendations suited to times and circumstances, I shall not absolutely determine. This I may affirm, that Jack gave it at least a new term, and formed it into the same dress and model as it lies deduced by me. I have long sought after this opportunity of doing justice to a society of men for whom I have a peculiar honour, and whose opinions as well as practices have been extremely misrepresented and traduced by the malice or ignorance of their adversaries. For I think it one of the greatest and best of human actions to remove prejudices and place things in their truest and fairest light, which I therefore boldly undertake, without any regards of my own beside conscience, for honour and the thanks. End of section 8. Section 9 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. The digression concerning the original, the use and improvement of madness in a commonwealth. Nor shall it in any ways detract from the just reputation of this famous sect, that its rise and institution are owing to such an author as I have described Jack to be. a person whose intellectuals were overturned and his brain shaken out of its natural position, which he commonly supposed to be a distemper, and called by the name of madness or frenzy. For if we take a survey of the greatest actions that have been performed in the world under the influence of single men, which are the establishment of new empires by conquest, the advance and progress of new schemes in philosophy, and the contriving as well as the propagating of new religions, we shall find the authors of them all to have been persons whose natural reason hath admitted great revolutions from their diet, their education, the prevalency of some certain temper, together with the particular influence of air and climate. Besides, there is something individual in human minds that easily kindles at the accidental approach and collision of certain circumstances, which, though of paltry and mean appearance, do often flame out into the greatest emergencies of life. Great turns are not always given by strong hands, but by lucky adaptation, and at proper seasons, and it is of no import where the fire was kindled, if the vapour has once got up into the brain. For the upper region of man is furnished like the middle region of the air. The materials are formed from causes of the widest difference, yet produce at last the same substance and effect. Mists arise from the earth, steams from dunghills, exhalations from the sea, and smoke from fire, yet all clouds are the same in composition as well as consequences, and the fumes issuing from a jakes will furnish as comely and useful a vapour as incense from an altar. Thus far, I suppose, will easily be granted me, and then it will follow that as the face of nature never produces rain but when it is overcast and disturbed, so human understanding seated in the brain must be troubled and overspread by vapours ascending from the lower faculties to water the invention and render it fruitful. Now, although these vapours, as it hath been already said, are of as various original as those of the skies, yet the crop they produce differs both in kind and degree merely according to the soil. I will produce two instances to prove and explain what I am now advancing. A certain great prince raised a mighty army, filled his coffers with infinite treasures, provided an invincible fleet, and all this without giving the least part of his design to his greatest ministers or his nearest favourites. Immediately the whole world was alarmed, the neighbouring crowns in trembling expectation towards what point the storm would burst, the small politicians everywhere forming profound conjectures. Some believed he had laid a scheme for universal monarchy. Others, after much insight, determined the matter to be a project for pulling down the Pope and setting up the reformed religion, which had once been his own. Some again, of a deeper sagacity, sent him into Asia to subdue the Turk and recover Palestine. In the midst of all these projects and preparations, a certain state surgeon, gathering the nature of the disease by these symptoms, attempted the cure. At one blow performed the operation, broke the bag, and out flew the vapour, nor did anything want to render it a complete remedy, only that the prince unfortunately happened to die in the performance. Now is the reader exceeding curious to learn from whence this vapour took its rise, which had so long set the nations at a gaze. What secret wheel, what hidden spring could put into motion so wonderful an engine? It was afterwards discovered that the movement of this whole machine had been directed by an absent female, who was removed into an enemy's country. What should an unhappy prince do in such ticklish circumstances as these? He tried in vain the poet's never-failing receipt of corpora caricae, for idque petit corpus mens unde et sacia amore, unde feritur eo tendit gestitque cure. Having to no purpose used all peaceable endeavours, the collected part of the semen raised and inflamed became adjust, converted to choler, turned head from the spinal duct, and ascended to the brain. The very same principle that influences a bully to break the windows of a woman who has jilted him, naturally stirs up a great prince to raise mighty armies and dream of nothing but sieges, battles, and victories. The other instance is what I have read somewhere in a very ancient author of a mighty king, who for the space of above 30 years amused himself to take and lose towns, beat armies, and be beaten,
drive princes out of their dominions, fright children from their bread and butter, burn, lay waste, plunder, dragoon, massacre subject and stranger, friend and foe, male and female. It is recorded that the philosophers of each country were in grave dispute upon causes natural, moral, and political, to find out where they should assign any original solution of this phenomenon. At last the vapour or spirit which animated the hero's brain, being in perpetual circulation, seized upon that region of the human body so renowned for furnishing the Civeta Occidentalis, and gathering there into a tumour, left the rest of the world for that time in peace. Of such mighty consequence is it where those exhalations fix, and of so little from whence they proceed. The same spirits which, in their superior progress, would conquer a kingdom, descending upon the anus, conclude in a fistula. Let us next examine the great introducers of new schemes in philosophy, and search till we can find from what faculty of the soul the disposition arises in mortal man of taking into his head to advance new systems with such an eager zeal, in things agreed on all hands impossible to be known, from what seeds this disposition springs, and to what quality of human nature these grand innovators have been indebted for their number of disciples, because it is plain that several of the chief among them, both ancient and modern, were usually mistaken by their adversaries, and indeed by all except their own followers, to have been persons crazed or out of their wits, having generally proceeded in the common course of their words and actions by a method very different from the vulgar dictates of unrefined reason, agreeing for the most part in their several models with their present undoubted successors in the academy of modern Bedlam, whose merits and principles I shall further examine in due place. Of this kind were Epicurus, Diogenes, Apollonius, Lucretius, Paracelsus, Descartes, and others who, if they were now in the world, tied fast and separate from their followers, would in this our undistinguishing age incur manifest danger of phlebotomy, and whips and chains and dark chambers and straw. For what man in their natural state or course of thinking did ever conceive it in his power to reduce the notions of all mankind exactly to the same length and breadth and height of his own? Yet this is the first humble and civil design of all innovators in the empire of reason. Epicurus modestly hoped that one time or other a certain fortuitous concourse of all men's opinions, after perpetual jostlings, the sharp with the smooth, the light and the heavy, the round and the square, would, by a certain plenumina, unite in the notions of atoms and void, as these did in the originals of all things. Cartesius reckoned to see before he died the sentiments of all philosophers, like so many lesser stars of his romantic system, wrapped and drawn within his own vortex. Now I would gladly be informed how it is possible to account for such imaginations as these in particular men, without recourse to my phenomenon of vapours ascending from the lower faculties to overshadow the brain, and there distilling into conceptions for which the narrowness of our mother tongue has not yet assigned any other name beside that of madness or frenzy. Let us therefore now conjecture how it comes to pass that none of these great prescribers do ever fail providing themselves and their notions with a number of implicit disciples, and I think the reason is easy to be assigned, for there is a peculiar string in the harmony of human understanding, which in several individuals is exactly of the same tune. This, if you can dexterously screw up to its right key, and then strike gently upon it whenever you have the good fortune to light among those of the same pitch, they will by a secret necessary sympathy strike exactly at the same time. And in this one circumstance lies all the skill or luck of the matter, for if you chance to jar the string among those who are either above or below your own height, instead of subscribing to your doctrine, they will tie you fast, call you mad, and feed you with bread and water. It is therefore a point of the nicest conduct to distinguish and adapt this noble talent with respect to the differences of persons and of times. Cicero understood this very well, when writing to a friend in England, with a caution among other matters to beware of being cheated by our hackney coachmen, who, it seems, in those days were as arrant rascals as they are now, has these remarkable words: Est quod gaudeas te in ista loca venisse, ubi aliquid sapere viderere. For, to speak a bold truth, It is a fatal miscarriage so ill to order affairs as to pass for a fool in one company, when in another you might be treated as a philosopher, which I desire some certain gentlemen of my acquaintance to lay up in their hearts as a very sensible innuendo. This, indeed, was the fatal mistake of that worthy gentleman, my most ingenious friend Mr. Wotton, a person in appearance ordained for great designs as well as performances, whether you will consider his notions or his looks. Surely no man ever advanced into the public with fitter qualifications of body and mind for the propagation of a new religion. Oh, and those happy talents misapplied to vain philosophy, being turned into their proper channels of dreams and visions, where distortion of mind and countenance are of such sovereign use, the base, detracting world would not then have dared to report that something is amiss, that his brain hath undergone an unlucky shake, which even his brother modernists themselves, like ungrates, do whisper so loud that it reaches up to the very garret I am now writing. Lastly, whoever pleases to look into the fountains of enthusiasm from whence in all ages have eternally proceeded such fattening streams will find the spring head to have been as troubled and muddy as the current. Of such great emolument is a tincture of this vapour which the world calls madness, that without its help the world would not only be deprived of those two great blessings, conquests and systems, but even all mankind would unhappily be reduced to the same belief in things invisible. Now the former postulatum being held, that is of no import from what originals this vapour proceeds, but either in what angles it strikes and spreads over the understanding, or upon what species of brain it ascends, it will be a very delicate point to cut the feather and divide the several reasons to a nice and curious reader, how this numerical difference in the brain can produce effects of so vast a difference from the same vapour as to be the sole point of individuation between Alexander the Great, Jack of Leyden, and Monsieur Descartes. The present argument is the most abstracted that ever I engaged in. It strains my faculties to the highest stretch, and I desire the reader to attend with utmost propensity, for I now proceed to unravel this knotty point. There is in mankind a certain hic multa desiderantur, and that is I take to be a clear solution of the matter. Having therefore so narrowly passed through this intricate difficulty, the reader will, I am sure, agree with me in the conclusion that if the moderns mean by madness only a disturbance or transposition of the brain, by force of certain vapours issuing from the lower faculties, then has this madness been the parent of all those mighty revolutions that have been happened in empire, in philosophy, and in religion. For the brain, in its natural position and state of serenity, dispossesseth its own to pass his life in the common forms, without any thought of subduing multitudes to his own power, his reasons, or his visions. And the more he shapes his understanding by the pattern of human learning, the less he is inclined to form parties after his particular notions, because that instructs him in his private infirmities, as well as in the stubborn ignorance of the people. But when a man's fancy gets astride on his reason, when imagination is at cuffs with the senses, and common understanding as well as common sense is kicked out of doors, the first proselyte he makes is himself. And when that is once compassed, the difficulty is not so great in bringing over others a strong delusion, always operating from without as vigorously as from within. For cant and vision are to the ear and the eye the same that tickling is to the touch. Those entertainments and pleasures we most value in life are such as dupe and play the wag with the senses. For if we take an examination of what is generally understood by happiness, as it has respect either to the understanding or the senses, we shall find all its properties and adjuncts will herd under this short definition, that it is a perpetual possession of being well deceived. And first, with relation to the mind or understanding, it is manifest what mighty advantages fiction has over truth, and the reason is just at our elbow, because imagination can build nobler scenes, and produce more wonderful revolutions than fortune or nature will be at the expense to furnish. Nor is mankind so much to blame in his choice thus determining him, if we consider that the debate merely lies between things past and things conceived, and so the question is only this, whether things that have place in the imagination may not as properly be said to exist as those that are seated in the memory, which may be justly held in the affirmative, and very much to the advantage of the former, since this is acknowledged to be the womb of things, and the other allowed to be no more than the grave. Again, if we take this definition of happiness and examine it with reference to the senses, it will be acknowledged wonderfully adapt. How sad and insipid do all objects accost us that are not conveyed in the vehicle of delusion! How shrunk, if everything as it appears in the glass of nature, so that if it were not for the assistance of artificial mediums, false lights, refracted angles, varnish, and tinsel, there would be a mighty level in the felicity and enjoyments of mortal men. If this were seriously considered by the world, as I have a certain reason to suspect it hardly will, men would no longer reckon among their high points of wisdom the art of exposing weak sides and publishing infirmities, an employment, in my opinion, neither better nor worse than that of unmasking, which I think has never been allowed fair usage, either in the world or the playhouse. In the proportion that credulity is a more peaceful possession of the mind than curiosity, so far preferable is that wisdom which converses about the surface to that pretended philosophy which enters into the depths of things and then comes gravely back with informations and discoveries that in the inside they are good or nothing. The two senses to which all objects first address themselves are the sight and the touch. These never examine farther than the colour, the shape, the size, and whatever other qualities dwell or are drawn by art upon the outward of bodies, and then comes reason officiously with tools for cutting and opening and mangling and piercing, offering to demonstrate that they are not of the same consistence quite through. Now I take all this to be the last degree of perverting nature, one of whose eternal laws it is to put her best furniture forward. And therefore, in order to save the charges of all such expensive anatomy for the time to come, I do here think fit to inform the reader that in such conclusions as this reason is certainly in the right, and that in most corporeal beings which have fallen under my cognizance, the outside hath been infinitely preferable to the in, whereof I have been further convinced from some late experiments. Last week I saw a woman flayed, and you will hardly believe how much it altered her person for the worse. Yesterday I ordered the carcass of a bow to be stripped in my presence, when we were all amazed to find so many unsuspected faults under one suit of clothes. Then I laid open his brain, his heart, and his spleen, but I plainly perceived at every operation that the farther we proceeded we found the defects increase upon us in number and bulk, from all which I justly formed this conclusion to myself, that whatever philosopher or projector can find out an art to solder and patch up the flaws and imperfections of nature will deserve much better of mankind, and teach us a more useful science than that so much in present esteem of widening and exposing them, like him who held anatomy to be the ultimate end of physic, and he whose fortunes and dispositions have placed him in a convenient station to enjoy the fruits of this noble art, he that can with Epicurus content his ideas with the films and images that fly off upon his senses from the superficies of things, such as man, truly wise, creams of nature, leaving the sour and the dregs for philosophy and reason to lap up. This is a sublime and refined point of felicity, called the possession of being well deceived, the serene, peaceful state of being a fool among knaves. But, to return to madness, it is certain that according to the system I have above deduced, every species thereof proceeds from a redundancy of vapour. Therefore, as some kinds of frenzy give double strength to the sinews, so there are of other species which add vigour and life and spirit to the brain. Now it usually happens that these active spirits, getting possession of the brain, resemble those that haunt other waste and empty dwellings, which, for want of business, either vanish and carry away a piece of the house, or else stay at home and fling it all out of the windows. By which are mystically displayed the two principal branches of madness, in which some philosophers, not considering so well as I, have mistook to be different in their causes, over hastily assigning the first to deficiency and the other to redundance. I think it therefore manifest, from what I have here advanced, that the main point of skill and address is to furnish employment for this redundancy of vapour, and prudently to adjust the seasons of it, by which means it may certainly become of cardinal and catholic emolument in a commonwealth. Thus one man, choosing a proper juncture, leaps into a gulf, from thence proceeds a hero, and is called the saviour of his country. Another achieves the same enterprise, but unluckily timing it, has left the brand of madness fixed as a reproach upon his memory. Upon so nice a distinction are we taught to repeat the name of Curtius with reverence and love, that of Empedocles with hatred and contempt. Thus also it is usually conceived that the elder Brutus only personated the fool and madman for the good of the public. But this was nothing else than a redundancy of the same vapour, long misapplied, called by the Latins ingenium par negotiis, or, to translate it as nearly as I can, a sort of frenzy, never in its right element, till you take it up in business of the state. Upon all which, and many other reasons of equal weight, though not equally curious, I do here gladly embrace an opportunity I have long sought for, of recommending it as a very noble undertaking to Sir Edward Seymour, Sir Christopher Musgrave, Sir John Bowles, John Howe, Esquire, and other patriots concerned, that they would move for leave to bring in a bill for appointing commissioners to inspect into Bedlam and the parts adjacent, who shall be empowered to send for persons, papers, and records, to examine into the merits and qualifications of every student and professor, to observe with utmost exactness the several dispositions and behaviour, by which means, duly distinguishing and adapting their talents, they might produce admirable instruments for the several offices in a state, civil and military, proceeding in such methods as I shall here humbly propose. And I hope the gentle reader will give some allowance to my great solicitudes in this important affair, upon account of that high esteem I have ever borne that honourable society, whereof I had sometime the happiness to be an unworthy member. Is any student tearing his straw in piecemeal, swearing and blaspheming, biting his grate, foaming at the mouth, and emptying his vessel in the spectators' faces, let the right worshipful, the commissioners of inspection, give him a regiment of dragoons, and send him into Flanders among the rest. Is another eternally talking, sputtering, gaping, bawling in a sound without period or article, what wonderful talents are here mislaid! Let him be furnished immediately with a green bag and papers, and threepence in his pocket, and away with him to Westminster Hall. You will find the third gravely taking the dimensions of his kennel, a person of foresight and insight, though kept quite in the dark. For why, like Moses, ecce cornuta erat eius facis, he walks duly in one pace, he treats your penny with due gravity and ceremony, he talks much of hard times and taxes, and the whore of Babylon bars up the wooden of his cell constantly at 8 o'clock, dreams of fire and shoplifters and court customers and privileged places. Now what a figure would all these acquirements amount to if the owner were sent into the city among his brethren? Behold a fourth in much and deep conversation with himself, biting his thumbs at proper junctures, his countenance chequered with business and design, sometimes walking very fast, with his eyes nailed to a paper that he holds in his hands, a great saver of time, somewhat think of hearing, very short of sight, but more of memory, a man ever in haste, a great hatcher and breeder of business, and excellent in the famous art of whispering nothing, a huge idolater of monosyllables and procrastination, so ready to give his word to everybody that he never keeps it, one that has forgot the common meaning of words, but an admirable retainer of the sound, extremely subject to the looseness of his occasions, are perpetually calling him away. If you approach his great and his familiar intervals, "Sir," says he, "give me a penny, and I'll sing you a song. But give me the penny first." Hence comes the common saying, and commoner practice, of parting with money for a song. What a complete system of court skill is here described in every branch of it, and all utterly lost with wrong application. Accost the whole of another kennel, first stopping your nose, you will behold a surly, gloomy, nasty, slovenly mortal, raking in his own dung and dabbling in his urine. The best part of his diet is the reversion of his own ordure, which, expiring into steams, whirls perpetually about, and at last re-infunds. His complexion is of a dirty yellow, with a thin scattered beard, exactly agreeable to that of his diet upon its first declination, like other insects, who, having their birth and education in an excrement, from thence borrow their colour and their smell. The student of this apartment is very sparing of his words, but somewhat over-liberal of his breath. He holds his hand out, ready to receive your penny, and immediately upon receipt withdraws to his former occupations. Now, is it not amazing to think the society of Warwick Lane should have no more concern for the recovery of so useful a member, who, if one may judge from these appearances, would become the greatest ornament to that illustrious body? Another student struts up fiercely to your teeth, puffing with his lips, half squeezing out his eyes, and very graciously holds out his hand to kiss. The keeper desires you not to be afraid of this professor, for he will do you no hurt. To him alone is allowed the liberty of the antechamber, and the orator of the place gives you to understand that this solemn person is a tailor run mad with pride. This considerable student is adorned with many other qualities, upon which at present I shall not further enlarge. Hark in your ear. I am strangely mistaken if all his address, his motions, and his airs would not then be very natural and in a proper element. I shall not descend so minutely as to insist upon the vast number of beaux, fiddlers, poets, and politicians that the world might recover by such a reformation. But what is more material, beside the clear gain redounding to the Commonwealth by so large an acquisition of persons to employ, whose talents and acquirements, if I be so bold to affirm it, are now buried or at least misapplied, it would be a mighty advantage accruing to the public from this inquiry, that all these would be very much excel and arrive at great perfection in their several kinds, which I think is manifest from what I have already shown, and shall enforce by this one plain instance, that even I myself, the author of these momentous truths, am a person whose imaginations are hard-mouthed and exceedingly disposed to run away with his reason, which I have observed from long experience to be a very light rider, and easily shook off, upon which account my friends will never trust me, alone, without a solemn promise to vent my speculations in this or the like manner, for the universal benefit of humankind, which perhaps the gentle, courteous, and candid reader, brimful of that modern charity and tenderness usually annexed to its office, will be very hardly persuaded to believe.
End of section 9. Section 10 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. A farther digression. It is an unanswerable argument of a very refined age, the wonderful civilities that have passed of late years between the nation of authors and that of readers. There can hardly pop out a play, a pamphlet, or a poem without a preface full of acknowledgments to the world for the general reception and applause they have given it, which the Lord knows where, or when, or from whom it received. In due deference to so laudable a custom, I do here return my humble thanks to His Majesty in both Houses of Parliament, to the Lords of the King's most honourable Privy Council, to the Reverend, the Judges, to the clergy and gentry and yeomanry of this land, but in a more especial manner to my worthy brethren and friends at Will's Coffee House, and Gresham College, and Warwick Lane, and Moorfields, and Scotland Yard, and Westminster Hall, and Guildhall, in short, to all inhabitants and retainers whatsoever, either in court, or church, or camp, or city, or country, for their generosity and universal acceptance of this divine treatise. I accept their approbation and good opinion with extreme gratitude, and to the utmost of my poor capacity shall take hold of all opportunities to return the obligation. I am also happy that fate has flung me into so blessed an age for the mutual felicity of booksellers and authors, whom I may safely affirm to be at this day the two only satisfied parties in England. Ask an author how his last piece has succeeded. Why, truly, he thanks his stars the world has been very favourable, and he has not the least reason to complain. And yet he wrote it in a week at bits and starts, when he could steal an hour from his urgent affairs, as it is 100 to 1 you may see further in the preface, to which he refers you, and for the rest of the bookseller. There you go as a customer and make the same question. He blesses his God, the thing takes wonderful. He is just printing a second edition, and has but 3 left in his shop. You beat down the price, sir, we shall not differ, and in hopes of your custom another time lets you have it as reasonable as you please. And pray send as many of your acquaintance as you will. I shall upon your account furnish them at all the same rate. Now it is not well enough considered to what accidents and occasions the world is indebted for the greatest part of those noble writings which hourly start up to entertain it. If it were not for a rainy day, a drunken vigil, a fit of the spleen, a course of physic, a sleepy Sunday, an ill run at dice, a long tailor's bill, a beggar's purse,
a factious head, a hot sun, costive diet, want of books, and a just contempt of learning. But for these events, I say, and some others too long to recite, especially a prudent neglect of taking brimstone inwardly, I doubt the number of authors and writings would dwindle away to a degree most woeful to behold. To confirm this opinion, hear the words of the famous troglodyte philosopher. It is certain, said he, some grains of folly are of course annexed as part in the composition of human nature, only the choice is left us whether we please to wear them inlaid or embossed, and we need not go very far to seek how that is usually determined, when we remember it is with human faculties as with liquors, the lightest will be ever at the top. There is in this famous island of Britain a certain paltry scribbler, very voluminous, whose character the reader cannot wholly be a stranger to. He deals in a pernicious kind of writings called second parts, and usually passes under the name of the author of the first. I easily foresee that as soon as I lay down my pen, this nimble operator will have stole it, and treat me as inhumanly as he has already done Dr. Blackmore, Lestrange, and many others who shall here be nameless. I therefore fly for justice and relief into the hands of that great rectifier of saddles and lover of mankind, Dr. Bentley, begging he will take this enormous grievance into his most modern consideration, and if it should so happen that the furniture of an ass in the shape of a second part must for my sins be clapped, by mistake, upon my back, that he will immediately please, in the presence of the world, to lighten me of the burden, and take it home to his own house, till the true beast thinks fit to call for it. In the meantime, I do here give this public notice, that my resolutions are to circumscribe within this discourse the whole stock of matter I have been so many years providing. Since my vein is once opened, I am content to exhaust it all at a running, for the peculiar advantage of my dear country, and for the universal benefit of mankind. Therefore, hospitably considering the number of my guests, they shall have my whole entertainment at a meal, and I scorn to set up the leavings in the cupboard. The guests cannot eat, may be given to the poor, and the dogs under the table may gnaw the bones. This I understand for a more generous proceeding than to turn the company's stomachs by inviting them again tomorrow to a scurvy meal of scraps. If the reader fairly considers the strength of what I have advanced in the foregoing section, I am convinced it will produce a wonderful revolution in his notions and opinions, and he will be abundantly better prepared to receive and to relish the concluding part of this miraculous treatise. Readers may be divided into three classes: the superficial, the ignorant, and the learned, and I have with much felicity fitted my pen to the genius and advantage of each. The superficial reader will be strangely provoked to laughter, which clears the breast and the lungs, is sovereign against the spleen, and most innocent of all diuretics. The ignorant reader, between whom and the former the distinction is extremely nice, will find himself disposed to stare, which is an admirable remedy for ill eyes, serves to raise and enliven the spirits, and wonderfully helps perspiration. But the reader truly learned, chiefly for whose benefit I wake when others sleep, and sleep when others wake, will here find sufficient matter to employ his speculations for the rest of his life. It were much to be wished, and I do here humbly propose for an experiment, that every prince in Christendom will take 7 of the deepest scholars in his dominions, and shut them up close for 7 years in 7 chambers, with a command to write 7 ample commentaries on this comprehensive discourse. I shall venture to affirm that, whatever difference may be found in their several conjectures, they will be all, without the least distortion, manifestly deducible from the text. Meantime, it is my earnest request that so useful an undertaking may be entered upon, if their Majesties please, with all convenient speed, because I have a strong inclination, before I leave the world, to taste a blessing which we mysterious writers can seldom reach till we have got into our graves, whether it is that fame, being a fruit grafted on the body, can hardly grow and much less ripen till the stock is in the earth, or whether she be a bird of prey, and is lured among the rest to pursue after the scent of a carcass, or whether she conceives her trumpet sounds best and farthest when she stands on a tomb, by the advantage of a rising ground and the echo of a hollow vault. It is true indeed, the republic of dark authors, after they once found out this excellent expedient of dying, have been peculiarly happy in the variety as well as extent of their reputation. For night being the universal mother of things, wise philosophers hold all writings to be fruitful in the proportion they are dark, and therefore the true illuminated, that is to say, the darkest of all, have met with such numberless commentators, whose scholastic midwifery hath delivered them of meanings that the authors themselves perhaps never conceived, and yet may very justly be allowed the lawful parents of them, the words of such writers being like seed, which, however scattered at random, when they light upon a fruitful ground, will multiply far beyond either the hopes or imagination of the sower. And therefore, in order to promote so useful a work, I will here take leave to glance a few innuendos that may be of great assistance to those sublime spirits who shall be appointed to labour in a universal comment upon this wonderful discourse. And first, I have couched a very profound mystery in the number of zeros, multiplied by 7 and divided by 9. Also, if a devout brother of the Rosy Cross will pray fervently for 63 mornings with a lively faith, and then transpose certain letters and syllables according to prescription in the 2nd and 5th section, they will certainly reveal into a full receipt of the opus magnum. Lastly, whoever will be at the pains to calculate the whole number of each letter in the treatise, and sum up the difference exactly between the several numbers, assigning the true natural cause for every such difference, the discoveries and the product will plentifully reward his labour. Then he must beware of Bythus and Sige, and be sure not to forget the qualities of Achamoth, Acudus, Lacrimis, Humecta, Prodit, Substantia, Adisu, Lucida, Tristidia, Solida, et Timore Mobilis, wherein Eugenius Philaletes hath committed an unpardonable mistake. End of section 10.
Section 11 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. A Tale of a Tub. After so wide a compass as I have wandered, I do now gladly overtake and close in with my subject, and shall henceforth hold on with it an even pace to the end of my journey, except some beautiful prospect appears within sight of my way, whereof, though at present I have neither warning nor expectation, yet upon such as accident, come when it will, I shall beg my reader's favour and company, allowing me to conduct him through it along with myself. For in writing it is as in travelling. If a man is in haste to be at home, well, I acknowledge to be none of my case, having never so little business as when I am there. If his horse be tired with long riding and ill ways, or be naturally a jade, I advise him clearly to make the straightest and the commonest road, be it ever so dirty. But then surely he must own such a man to be a scurvy companion at best. He splatters himself and his fellow travellers at every step. All their thoughts and wishes and conversation turn entirely upon the subject of their journey's end, and at every splash and plunge and stumble they heartily wish one another at the devil. On the other side, when the traveller and his horse are in heart and plight, when his purse is full, and the day before him, he takes the road only where it is clean or convenient, entertains his company there as agreeably as he can, but upon the first occasion carries them along with him to every delightful scene in view, whether of art, of nature, or of both. And if they chance to refuse out of stupidity or weariness, let them jog on by themselves and be damned. He'll overtake them at the next town, at which arriving he rides furiously through the men, women, and children, run out to gaze. 100 noisy curs run barking after him, of which if he honours the boldest with a lash of his whip, 'tis rather out of sport than revenge. But should some sourer mongrel dare too near an approach, he receives a salute on the chaps by an accidental stroke from the courser's heels, nor is any ground lost by the blow which sends him yelping and limping home. I now proceed to sum up the singular adventures of my renowned Jack, the state of whose dispositions and fortunes the careful reader does, no doubt, most exactly remember, as I last parted with him in the conclusion of a former section. Therefore his next care must be from 2 of the foregoing to extract a scheme of notions that may best fit his understanding for a true relish of what is to ensue.
Jack had not only calculated the first revolution of his brain so prudently as to give rise to that epidemic sect of Aeolists, but succeeding also into a new and strange variety of conceptions. The fruitfulness of his imagination led him into certain notions which, although in appearance very accountable, were not without their mysteries and their meanings, nor wanted followers to countenance and improve them. I shall therefore be extremely careful and exact in recounting such material passages of this nature as I have been able to collect either from undoubted tradition or indefatigable reading, and shall describe them as graphically as it is possible, and as far as notions of that height and latitude can be brought within the compass of a pen. Nor do I at all question but they will furnish plenty of noble matter for such whose converting imaginations dispose them to reduce all things into types, who can make shadows, no thanks to the sun, and then mould them into substances, no thanks to philosophy, whose peculiar talent lies in fixing tropes and allegories to the letter, and refining what is literal into figure and mystery. Jack had provided a fair copy of his father's will, engrossed in form upon a large skin of parchment, and resolving to act the part of a most dutiful son, he became the fondest creature of it imaginable. For although, as I have often told the reader, it consisted wholly in certain plain, easy directions about the management and wearing of their coats, with legacies and penalties in case of obedience or neglect, yet he began to entertain a fancy that the matter was deeper and darker, and therefore must needs have a great deal more of mystery at the bottom. "Gentlemen," said he, "I will prove this very skin of parchment to be meat, drink, and cloth, to be the philosopher's stone and the universal medicine." In consequence of which raptures he resolved to make use of it in the most necessary as well as the most paltry occasions of life. He had a way of working it into any shape he pleased, so that it served him for a nightcap when he went to bed, and for an umbrella in rainy weather. He would lap a piece of it about a sore toe, or, when he had fits, burn 2 inches under his nose, or, if anything lay heavy on his stomach, scrape off and swallow as much of the powder as would lie in a silver penny. They were all infallible remedies. With analogy to these refinements, his common talk and conversation ran wholly in the praise of his will, and he circumscribed the utmost of his eloquence within that compass, not daring to let slip a syllable without authority from thence. Once at a strange house, he was suddenly taken short upon an urgent juncture, whereon it may not be allowed too particularly to dilate, and being not able to call to mind, with that suddenness the occasion required, an authentic phrase for demanding the way to the back, he chose rather, as the more prudent course, to incur the penalty at such cases usually annexed. Neither was it possible for the united rhetoric of mankind to prevail with him to make himself clean again, because, having consulted the will upon this emergency, he met with a passage near the bottom, whether foisted in by the transcriber is not known, which seemed to forbid it. He made it a part of his religion never to say grace to his meat, nor could all the world persuade him, as the common phrase is, to eat his victuals like a Christian. He bore a strange kind of appetite to snap, dragon, and to the livid snuffs of a burning candle, which he would catch and swallow with an agility wonderful to conceive, and by this procedure maintained a perpetual flame in his belly, which, issuing in a glowing steam from both his eyes, as well as his nostrils and his mouth, made his head appear in a dark night like the skull of an ass, wherein a roguish boy hath conveyed a farthing candle, to the terror of his Majesty's liege subjects. Therefore he made use of no other expedient to light himself home, but was wont to say that a wise man was his own lantern. He would shut his eyes as he walked along the streets, and if he happened to bounce his head against a post or fall into the kennel, as he seldom missed either to do one or both, he would tell the gibing apprentices who looked on that he submitted with entire resignation as to a trip or a blow of fate, with whom he found by long experience how vain it was either to wrestle or to cuff, and whoever durst undertake to do either would be sure to come off with a swinging fall or a bloody nose. "It was ordained," said he, "some few days before the creation, that my nose and this very post should have a rencounter, and therefore Providence thought fit to send us both into the world in the same age, and to make us countrymen and fellow citizens.
Now, had my eyes been open, it is very likely the business might have been a great deal worse, for how many a confounded slip is daily got by a man with all his foresight about him. Besides, the eyes of the understanding see best when those of the senses are out of the way, and therefore blind men are observed to tread their steps with much more caution and conduct and judgment than those who rely with too much confidence upon the virtue of the visual nerve, which every little accident shakes out of order, and a drop or a film can wholly disconcert, like a lantern among a pack of roaring bullies, when they scour the streets, exposing its owner and itself to outward kicks and buffets, which both might have escaped if the vanity of appearing would have suffered them to walk in the dark. But further, if we examine the conduct of these boasted lights, it will prove yet a great deal worse than their fortune. It is true, I have broke my nose against this post, because Providence either forgot, or did not think it convenient, to twitch me by the elbow and give me notice to avoid it. But let not this encourage either the present age of posterity to trust their noses unto the keeping of their eyes, which may prove the fairest way of losing them for good and all. For, O ye eyes, ye blind guides, miserable guardians are ye of our frail noses, ye, I say, who fasten upon the first precipice in view, and then tow our wretched willing bodies after you to the very brink of destruction. But alas, that brink is rotten, our feet slip, and we tumble down prone into a gulf, without one hospitable shrub in the way to break the fall, a fall to which not any nose of mortal make is equal, except that of the giant Lord Salso, who was the lord of the Silver Bridge. Most properly, therefore, O eyes, and with great justice, may you be compared to those foolish lights which conduct men through dirt and darkness till they fall into a deep pit or a noisome bog. This I have produced as a scantling of Jack's great eloquence, and the force of his reasoning upon such abstruse matters. He was besides a person of great design and improvement in affairs of devotion, having introduced a new deity who has since met with a vast number of worshippers, by some called Babel, by others Chaos, who had an ancient temple of Gothic structure upon Salisbury Plain, famous for its shrine and celebration by pilgrims. When he had some roguish trick to play, he would down with his knees, up with his eyes, and fall to prayers, though in the midst of the kennel. Then it was that those who understood his pranks would be sure to get far enough out of his way, and whenever curiosity attracted strangers to laugh or to listen, he would of a sudden bespatter them with mud. In winter he went always loose and unbuttoned, and clad as thin as possible to let in the ambient heat, and in summer lapped himself close and thick to keep it out. In all revolutions of government he would make his court for the office of hangman general, and in the exercise of that dignity, wherein he was very dexterous, would make use of no other vizard than a long prayer. He had a tongue so musculous and subtile that he would twist it up into his nose and deliver a strange kind of speech from thence. He was also the first in these kingdoms who began to improve the Spanish accomplishment of braying, and having large ears perpetually exposed and erected, he carried his art to such a perfection that it was a point of great difficulty to distinguish either by the view or the sound between the original and the copy. He was troubled with a disease the reverse to that called the stinging of the tarantula, and would run dog-mad at the noise of music, especially a pair of bagpipes, but he would cure himself again by taking 2 or 3 turns in Westminster Hall or Billingsgate, or in a boarding school, or the Royal Exchange, or a state coffee-house. He was a person that feared no colours, but mortally hated all, and upon that account bore a cruel aversion to painters, insomuch that in his paroxysms, as he walked the streets, he would have his pockets loaded with stones to pelt at the signs. Having from his manner of living frequent occasions to wash himself, he would often leap over head and ears into the water, though it were in the midst of the winter, but was always observed to come out again much dirtier, if possible, than he went in. He was the first that ever found out the secret of contriving a soporiferous medicine to be conveyed in at the ears. It was a compound of sulphur and balm of Gilead with a little pilgrim's salve. He wore a large plaster of artificial caustics on his stomach, with the fervour of which he could set himself a groaning like the famous board upon application
of a red-hot iron. He would stand in the turning of a street, and calling to those who passed by, would cry to one, "Worthy sir, do me the honour of a good slap in the chaps;" to another, "Honest friend, pray favour me with a handsome kick in the rear." "Madam, shall I entreat a small box in the ear from your ladyship's fair hands?" "Noble captain, lend a reasonable thwack, for the love of God, with that cane of yours over these poor shoulders." And when he had by such earnest solicitations made a shift to procure a basting sufficient to swell up his fancy and his sides, he would return home extremely comforted, and full of terrible accounts of what he had undergone for the public good. "Observe this stroke," said he, showing his bare shoulders. "A plaguy janissary gave it me this very morning at 7 o'clock, as with much ado I was driving off the Great Turf. Neighbours mine, this broken head deserves a plaster. Had poor Jack been tender of his noddle, you would have seen the Pope and the French King long before this time of day among your wives and your warehouses. Dear Christians, the great Mogul was come as far as Whitechapel, and you may thank these poor sides that he hath not, God bless us, already swallowed up man, woman, and child." It was highly worth observing the singular effects of that aversion or antipathy which Jack and his brother Peter seemed, even to affectation, to bear towards each other. Peter had lately done some rogueries that forced him to abscond, and he seldom ventured to stir out before night for fear of bailiffs. Their lodgings were at the two most distant parts of the town from each other, and whenever their occasions or humours called them abroad, they would make choice of the oddest, unlikely times and most uncouth rounds that they could invent, that they might be sure to avoid one another. Yet after all this, it was their perpetual fortune to meet, the reason of which is easy enough to apprehend. For the frenzy and the spleen of both having the same foundation, we may look upon them as two pair of compasses equally extended, and the fixed foot of each remaining in the same centre, which, though moving contrary ways at first, will be sure to encounter somewhere or other in the circumference. Besides, it was among the great misfortunes of Jack to bear a huge personal resemblance with his brother Peter. Their humour and dispositions were not only the same, but there was a close analogy in their shape, their size, and their mien, insomuch as nothing was more frequent than for a bailiff to seize Jack by the shoulders and cry, "Mr. Peter, you are the king's prisoner," or at other times for one of Peter's nearest friends to accost Jack with open arms. "Dear Peter, I am glad to see thee. Pray send me one of your best medicines for the worms." This, we may suppose, was a mortifying return of those pains and proceedings Jack had laboured in so long, and finding how directly opposite all his endeavours had answered to the sole end and intention which he had proposed to himself, how could it avoid having terrible effects upon a head and heart so furnished as his? However, the poor remainders of his coat bore all the punishment. The orient sun never entered upon his diurnal progress without missing a piece of it. He hired a tailor to stitch up the collar so close that it was ready to choke him, and squeezed out his eyes at such a rate as one could see nothing but the white. What little was left of the main substance of the coat he rubbed every day for 2 hours against a rough cast wall, in order to grind away the remnants of lace and embroidery, but at the same time went on with so much violence that he proceeded a heathen philosopher. Yet after all he could do of this kind, the success continued still to disappoint his expectation, for as it is the very nature of rags to bear a kind of mock resemblance to finery, there being a sort of fluttering appearance in both, which it is not to be distinguished at a distance in the dark, or by short-sighted eyes, so in those junctures it fared with Jack and his tatters, that they offered to the very first view a ridiculous flaunting, which, assisting the resemblance in person and air, thwarted all his projects of separation, and left so near a similitude between them as frequently deceived the very disciples and followers of both. Desunt non nulla. The old Sclavonian proverb said well that it is with men as with asses, whoever could keep them fast must find a very good hold at their ears. Yet I think we may affirm, and hath been verified by repeated experience, that effugiet tamen haec scleratus vincula pretius. It is good, therefore, to read the maxims of our ancestors with great allowances in times and persons, for if we look into primitive records we shall find that no revolutions have been so great or so frequent as those of human ears. In former days there was a curious invention to catch and keep them, which I think we may justly reckon among the artes perditae. And how can it be otherwise, when in these latter centuries the very species is not only diminished to a very lamentable degree, but the poor remainder is also degenerated so far as to mock our skilfullest tenure? For if only the slitting of one ear in a stag hath been found sufficient to propagate the defect through a whole forest, why should we wonder at the greatest consequences from so many loppings and mutilations to which the ears of our fathers and our own have been of late so much exposed? It is true indeed that while this island of ours was under the domain of grace, many endeavours were made to improve the growth of ears once more among us. The proportion of largeness was not only looked upon as an ornament of the outward man, but as a type of grace in the inward. Besides, it is held by naturalists that if there be a protuberancy of parts in the superior region of the body, as in the ears and nose, there must be a parity also in the inferior, and therefore in that truly pious age the males in every assembly, according as they were gifted, appeared very forward in exposing their ears to view, and the regions about them, because Hippocrates tells us that when the vein behind the ear happens to be cut, a man becomes a eunuch, and the females were nothing backward in beholding and edifying by them, whereof those who had already used the means looked about them with great concern in hopes of conceiving a suitable offspring by such a prospect. Others, who stood candidates for benevolence, found there a plentiful choice, and were sure to fix upon such as discovered the largest ears, that the breed might not dwindle between them. Lastly, the devouter sisters, who looked upon all extraordinary dilations of that member as protrusions of zeal, or spiritual excrescences, were sure to honour every head they sat upon as if they had been cloven tongued, but especially those of the preacher, whose ears were usually of the prime magnitude, which upon that account he was very frequent and exact in exposing, with all advantages to the people in his rhetorical paroxysms, turning sometimes to hold forth the one, and sometimes to hold forth the other, from which custom the whole operation of preaching is to this very day among their professors styled by the phrase of holding forth. Such was the progress of the saints for advancing the size of that member, and it is thought the success would have been every way answerable, if in process of time a cruel king had not arose, who raised a bloody persecution against all ears above a certain standard, upon which some were glad to hide their flourishing sprouts in a black border, others crept wholly under a periwig, some were slit, others cropped, and a great number sliced off to the stumps. But of this more hereafter in my general history of ears, which I design very speedily to bestow upon the public. From this brief survey of the falling state of ears in the last age, and the small care had to advance their ancient growth in the present, it is manifest how little reason we can have to rely upon a hold so short, so weak, and so slippery, and that whoever desires to catch mankind fast must have recourse to some other methods, now that he will examine human nature with circumspection enough, may discover several handles, whereof the 6 senses afford one apiece, beside a great number that are screwed to the passions, and some few riveted to the intellect. Among these last, curiosity is one, and of all others affords the firmest grasp. Curiosity, that spur in the side, that bridle in the mouth, that ring in the nose of a lazy, an impatient, and a grunting reader. By this handle it is that an author should seize upon his readers, which as soon as he hath once compassed, all resistance and struggling are in vain, and they become his prisoners, as close as he pleases, till weariness or dullness force him to let go his grip. And therefore I, the author of this miraculous treatise, having hitherto beyond expectation maintained by the aforesaid handle a firm hold upon my gentle readers, it is with great reluctance that I am at length compelled to remit my grasp, leaving them in the perusal of what remains to that natural occitancy inherent in the tribe. I can only assure thee, courteous reader, for both our comforts, that my concern is altogether equal to thine, for my unhappiness in losing or mislaying among my papers the remaining part of these memoirs, which consisted of accidents, turns, and adventures, both new, agreeable, and surprising, and therefore calculated in all due points to the delicate taste of this our noble age. But alas, with my utmost endeavours I have been able only to retain a few of the heads, under which there was a full account how Peter got a protection out of the King's Bench, and of a reconcilement between Jack and him, upon a design they had in a certain rainy night to trepan brother Martin into a sponging house, and there strip him to the skin; how Martin with much ado showed them both a fair pair of heels; how a new warrant came out against Peter, upon which Jack left him in the lurch, stole his protection, and made use of it himself; how Jack's tatters came into fashion in court and city; how he got upon a great horse and ate custard. But the particulars of all these, with several others which have now slid out of my memory, are lost beyond all hopes of recovery, for which misfortune leaving my readers to condole with each other as far as they shall find it to agree with their several constitutions, but conjuring them by all the friendship that has passed between us, from the title page to this, not to proceed so far as to injure their healths for an accident past remedy, I now go on to the ceremonial part of an accomplished writer, and therefore by a courtly modern least of all others to be omitted. End of section 11. Section 12 of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. The conclusion. Going too long is a cause of abortion as effectual, though not so frequent, as going too short, and holds true especially in the labours of the brain. Well fare the heart of that noble Jesuit who first adventured to confess in print that books must be suited to their several seasons, like dress and diet and diversions, and better fare our noble notion for refining upon this among other French modes. I am living fast to see the time when a book that misses its tide shall be neglected as the moon by day, or like mackerel a week after the season. No man has more nicely observed our climate than the bookseller who bought the copy of this work. He knows to a tittle what subjects will best go off in a dry year, and which is proper to expose foremost when the weather-glass is fallen too much rain. When he had seen this treatise and consulted his almanac upon it, he gave me to understand that he had manifestly considered the two principal things, which were the bulk and the subject, and found it would never take but after a long vacation, and then only in case it should happen to be a hard year for turnips. Upon which I desired to know, considering my urgent necessities, what he thought might be acceptable this month. He looked westward and said, "I doubt we shall have a bit of bad weather. However, if you could prepare some pretty little banter, but not in verse, or a small treatise upon, then it would run like wildfire. But if it hold up, I already have hired an author to write something against Dr. Bentley, which I am sure will turn to account." At length we agreed upon this expedient, that when a customer comes to one of these, and desires in confidence to know the author, he will tell him very privately as a friend, naming whichever of the wits shall happen to be that week in the vogue, and if Durfey's last play should be in course, I had as lieve he may be the person as Congreve. This I mention because I am wonderfully well acquainted with the present relish of courteous readers, and have often observed with singular pleasure that a fly driven from a honey-pot will immediately, with very good appetite, alight and finish his meal on an excrement. I have one word to say upon the subject of profound writers, who are grown very numerous of late, and I know very well the judicious world is resolved to list me in that number. I conceive, therefore, as to the business of being profound, that it is with writers as with wells. A person with good eyes can see to the bottom of the deepest, provided any water be there, and that often when there is nothing in the world at the bottom besides dryness and dirt, though it be but a yard and half underground, it shall pass, however for wondrous deep, upon no wiser reason than because it is wondrous dark. I am now trying an experiment, very frequent among modern authors, which is to write upon nothing. When the subject is utterly exhausted, to let the pen still move on, by some called the ghost of wit, delighting to walk after the death of its body. And to say the truth, there seems to be no part of knowledge in fewer hands than that of discerning when to have done. By the time that an author has written out a book, he and his readers are become old acquaintance, and grow very loath to part. So that I have sometimes known it to be in writing as in visiting, that the ceremony of taking leave has employed more time than the whole conversation before. The conclusion of a treatise resembles the conclusion of human life, which has sometimes been compared to the end of a feast, where few are satisfied to depart, ut plenus vitae conviva. For men will sit down after the fullest meal, though it be only to dose or to sleep out the rest of the day. But in this latter I differ extremely from other writers, and shall be too proud if, by all my labours I can have any ways contributed to the repose of mankind in times so turbulent and unquiet as these. Neither do I think such an employment so very alien from the office of a wit as some would suppose, for among a very polite nation in Greece there were the same temples built and consecrated to Sleep and the Muses, between which two deities they believed the strictest friendship was established. I have one concluding favour to request of my reader, that he will not expect to be equally diverted and informed by every line or every page of this discourse, but give some allowance to the author's spleen and short fits or intervals of dullness as well as his own, and lay it seriously to his conscience whether, if he were walking the streets in dirty weather or a rainy day, he would allow it fair dealing in folks at their ease from a window to criticise his gait and ridicule his dress at such a juncture. In my disposure of employments of the brain, I have thought fit to make invention the master, and to give method and reason the office of his lackeys. Cause of this distribution was from observing it my peculiar case to be often under a temptation of being witty upon occasion where I could be neither wise nor sound, nor anything to the matter in hand. And I am too much a servant of the modern way to neglect any such opportunities, whatever pains or improprieties I may be at to introduce them. So I have observed that from a laborious collection of 738 flowers and shining hints of the best modern authors, digested with great reading into my book of commonplaces, I have not been able, after 5 years, to draw hook or force into common conversation any more than a dozen, of which dozen the one moiety failed of success by being dropped among unsuitable company, and the other cost me so many strains and traps and ambushes to introduce that I at length resolved to give it over. Now this disappointment, to discover a secret, I must own, gave me the first hint of setting up for an author, and I have since found among some particular friends that is become a very general complaint, and has produced the same effects upon many others. For I have remarked many a towardly word to be wholly neglected or despised in discourse, which hath passed very smoothly with some consideration and esteem after its preferment and sanction in print. But now since by the liberty and encouragement of the press I am grown absolute master of the occasions and opportunities to expose the talents I have acquired, I already discover that the issues of my observanda begin to grow too large for the receipts. Therefore I shall here pause a while, till I find by feeling the world's pulse and my own that it will be of absolute necessity for us both to resume my pen. In some early editions of the Tale of a Tub, Swift added under the title of what follows after section 9 the following sketch for A History of Martin. The History of Martin, giving an account of his departure from Jack and their setting up for themselves, on which account they are obliged to travel and meet many disasters. Finding no shelter near Peter's habitation, Martin succeeds in the north. Peter thunders against Martin for the loss of the large revenue he used to receive from thence. Harry Huff sent Martin a challenge in fight, which he received. Peter rewards Harry for the pretended victory, which encouraged Harry to huff Peter also, with many other extraordinary adventures of the said Martin, in several places with many considerable persons, with a digression concerning the nature, usefulness, and necessity of wars and quarrels. How Jack and Martin, being parted, set up each for himself. How they travelled over hills and dales, met many disasters, suffered much for the good cause, and struggled with difficulties and wants, not having where to lay their head, by all which they afterwards proved themselves to be right fathers' sons, and Peter to be spurious. Finding no shelter near Peter's habitation, Martin travelled northwards, and finding the Thuringians, a neighbouring people, disposed to change, he set up his stage first among them, where, making it his business to cry down Peter's powders, plasters, salves, and drugs, which he had sold a long time at a dear rate, allowing Martin none of the profit, though he had been often employed in recommending and putting them off, the good people, willing to save their pence, began to hearken to Martin's speeches. How several great lords took the hint, and on the same account declared for Martin, particularly one who, not having had enough of one wife, wanted to marry a second, and knowing Peter used not to grant such licenses but at a swingeing price, he struck up a bargain with Martin, whom he found more tractable, and who assured him he had the same power to allow such things. How most of the other northern lords, for their own private ends, withdrew themselves and their dependents from Peter's authority and closed in with Martin. How Peter, enraged at the loss of such large territories and consequently of so much revenue, thundered against Martin and sent out the strongest and most terrible of his bulls to devour him, but this having no effect, and Martin defending himself boldly and dexterously, Peter at last put forth proclamations declaring Martin and all his adherents rebels and traitors, ordaining and requiring all his loving subjects to take up arms and to kill, burn, and destroy all and every one of them, promising large rewards, etc., upon which ensued bloody wars and desolation. How Harry Huff, Lord of Albion, one of the greatest bullies of those days, sent a cartel to Martin to fight him on a stage at cudgels, quarterstaff, backsword, etc. Hence the origin of that genteel custom of prize fighting, so well known and practised to this day among those polite islanders, though unknown everywhere else. How Martin, being a bold, blustering fellow, accepted the challenge, how they met and fought, to the great diversion of the spectators, and after giving one another broken heads and many bloody wounds and bruises, how they both drew off victorious, in which their example had been frequently imitated by great clerks and others since that time. How Martin's friends applauded his victory, and how Lord Harry's friends complimented him on the same score, and particularly Lord Peter, who sent him a fine feather for his cap, to be worn by him and his successors as a perpetual mark of his bold defence of Lord Peter's cause. How Harry, flushed with his pretended victory over Martin, began to huff Peter also, at last downright quarrelled with him about a wench. How some of Lord Harry's tenants, ever fond of changes, began to talk kindly of Martin, for which he mauled them soundly, as he did also those that adhered to Peter. How he turned some out of house and hold, others he hanged or burnt, etc. How Harry Huff, after a deal of blustering, wenching, and bullying, died, and was succeeded by a good-natured boy, who, giving way to the general bent of his tenants, allowed Martin's notions to spread everywhere, and take deep root in ambition. How after his death the farm fell into the hands of a lady who was violently in love with Lord Peter. How she purged the whole country with fire and sword, resolved not to leave the name or remembrance of Martin. How Peter triumphed, and set up shops again for selling his own powders, plasters, and salves, which were now declared the only true ones, Martin's being all declared counterfeit. How great numbers of Martin's friends left the country, and travelling up and down in foreign parts, were acquainted with many of Jack's followers, and took a liking to many of their notions and ways, which they afterwards brought back into ambition, now under another landlady, more moderate and more cunning than the former. How she endeavoured to keep friendship both with Peter and Martin, and trimmed for some time between the two, not without countenancing and assisting at the same time many of Jack's followers, but finding no possibility of reconciling all the three brothers, because each would be master and allow no other salves, powders, or plasters to be used but his own, she discarded all three, and set up a shop for those of her own farm, well furnished with powders, plasters, salves, and all other drugs necessary, all right and true, composed according to receipts made by physicians and apothecaries of her own creating, which they extracted out of Peter's and Martin's and Jack's receipt books, and of this medley or hodgepodge made up a dispensatory of their own, strictly forbidding any other to be used, and particularly Peter's, from which the greatest part of this new dispensatory was stolen. How the lady, farther to confirm this change, wisely imitating her father, degraded Peter from the rank he pretended as eldest brother, and set herself in his place as head of the family, and ever after wore her father's old cap, with the fine feather he had got from Peter for standing his friend, which has likewise been worn with no small ostentation to this day by all her successors, though declared enemies to Peter. How Lady Bess and her physicians, being told of many defects and imperfections in the new medley dispensatory, resolved on a further alteration to purge it from a great deal of Peter's trash that still remained in it, but were prevented by her death. How she was succeeded by a north country farmer, who pretended great skill in the managing of farms, though he could never govern his own poor little farm, nor yet this large new one after he got it. How this new landlord, to show his valour and dexterity, fought against enchanters, weeds, giants, and windmills, and claimed great honour for his victories. How his successor, no wiser than he, occasioned great disorders by the new methods he took to manage his farms. How he attempted to establish in his northern farm the same dispensatory used in the southern, but miscarried because Jack's powders, pills, salves, and plasters were there in great vogue. Where the author finds himself embarrassed for having introduced into his history a new sect different from the three he had undertaken to treat of, and how his inviolable respect to the sacred number 3 obliges him to reduce these 4, as he intends to do all other things, to that number, and for that end to drop the former Martin, and to substitute in his place Lady Bess's institution, which is to pass under the name of Martin in the sequel of this true history, This weighty point being cleared, the author goes on and describes mighty quarrels and squabbles between Jack and Martin, how sometimes the one had the better and sometimes the other, to the great desolation of both farms, till at last both sides concur to hang up the landlord, who pretended to die a martyr for Martin, though he had been true to neither side, and was suspected by many to have great affection for Peter. A digression on the nature, usefulness, and necessity of wars and quarrels. This being a matter of great consequence, the author intends to treat it methodically, and at large in a treatise apart, and here to give only some hints of what his large treatise contains. The state of war, natural to all creatures. War is an attempt to take by violence from others part of what they have and we want. Every man, fully sensible of his own merit, and finding it not duly regarded by others, has a natural right to take from them all that he thinks due to himself, and every creature, finding its own wants more than those of others, has the same right to take everything its nature requires. Brutes, much more modest in their pretensions this way than men, and mean men more than great ones. The higher one raises his pretensions this way, the more bustle he makes about them, the more success he has, the greater hero. Thus greater souls, in proportion to their superior merit, claim a greater right to take everything from meaner folks. This the true foundation of grandeur and heroism, and of the distinction of degrees among men. War, therefore, necessary to establish subordination and to found cities, kingdoms, etc., as also to purge bodies politic of gross humours. Wise princes find it necessary to have wars abroad to keep peace at home. War, famine, and pestilence, the usual cures for corruption in bodies politic. A comparison of these three, the author is to write a panegyric on each one of them. The greatest part of mankind loves war more than peace. There are but few and mean-spirited that live in peace with all men. The modest and meek of all kinds always prey to those of more noble or stronger appetites. The inclination to war universal. Those that cannot or dare not make war in person employ others to do it for them. This maintains bullies, bravos, cutthroats, lawyers, soldiers, etc. Most professions would be useless if all were peaceable. Hence brutes want neither smiths nor lawyers, magistrates nor joiners, soldiers or surgeons. Brutes, having but narrow appetites, are incapable of carrying on or perpetuating war against their own species, or of being led out in troops and multitudes to destroy one another. These prerogatives proper to men alone. The excellency of human nature demonstrated by the vast train of appetites, passions, wants, etc., that attend it. This matter to be more fully treated in the author's panegyric on mankind. History of Martin continued. How Jack, having got rid of the old landlord, set up another to his mind, quarrelled with Martin, and turned him out of doors. How he pillaged all his shops, and abolished his whole dispensatory. How the new landlord laid about him, mauled Peter, worried Martin, and made the whole neighbourhood tremble. How Jack's friends fell out among themselves, split into 1,000 parties, turned all things topsy-turvy, till everybody grew weary of them, and at last, the blustering landlord dying, Jack was kicked out of doors, a new landlord brought in, and Martin re-established. How this new landlord let Martin do what he pleased, and Martin agreed to do everything his pious landlord desired, provided Jack might be kept low. Several efforts Jack made up to raise up his head, but all in vain, till at last the landlord died, and was succeeded by one who was a great friend to Peter, who, to humble Martin, gave Jack some liberty. How Martin grew enraged at this, called in a foreigner, and turned out the landlord, on which Jack concurred with Martin, because this landlord was entirely devoted to Peter, into whose arms he threw himself and left his country. How the new landlord secured Martin in the full possession of his former rights, but would not allow him to destroy Jack, who had always been his friend. How Jack got up his head in the north, and put himself in possession of a whole canton, to the great discontent of Martin, who, finding also that some of Jack's friends were allowed to live and get their bread in the south parts of the country, grew highly discontented with the new landlord he had called in to his assistance. How this landlord kept Martin in order, upon which he fell into a raging fever, and swore he would hang himself, or join in with Peter, unless Jack's children were all turned out to starve. Of several attempts to cure Martin, and make peace between him and Jack, that they might unite against Peter, but all made ineffectual by the great address of a number of Peter's friends, that herded among Martin's, and appeared the most zealous for his interest. How Martin, getting abroad in this mad fit, looked so like Peter in his air and dress, and talked so like him that many of the neighbours could not distinguish the one from the other, especially when Martin went up and down, strutting in Peter's armour, which he had borrowed to fight Jack, what remedies were used to cure Martin's distemper. Here the author, being seized with a fit of dullness to which he was very subject, after having read a poetical epistle of Preface.to, had entirely composed his senses, so that he has not writ a line since. N.B. Some things that follow this, not in the MS, but seem to have been written since, to fill up the place of what was not thought convenient then to print. A project for the universal benefit of mankind. The author, having laboured so long and done so much to serve and instruct the public, without any advantage to himself, has at last thought of a project which will tend to the great benefit of all mankind, and produce a handsome revenue to the author. He intends to print by subscription, in 96 large volumes in folio, an exact description of Terra Australis Incognita, collected with great care, and prints from 999 learned and pious authors of undoubted veracity. The whole work, illustrated with maps and cuts agreeable to the subject, and done by the best masters, will cost 1 guinea, each volume to subscribers, 1 guinea to be paid in advance, and afterwards a guinea on receiving each volume except the last. This work will be of great use for all men, and necessary for all families, because it contains exact accounts of all the provinces, colonies, and mansions of that spacious country where, by general doom, all transgressors of the law are to be transported, and every one having this work may choose out the fittest and best place for himself, there being enough for all, so as every one shall be fully satisfied. The author supposes that 1 copy of this work will be bought at the public charge, or out of the parish rates, for every parish church in the 3 kingdoms, and in all the dominions thereunto belonging, and that every family that can command £10 per annum, even though retrenched from less necessary expenses, will subscribe for 1. He does not think of giving out above 9 volumes nearly, and considering the number requisite, he intends to print at least 100,000 for the first edition. He is to print proposals against next term with a specimen and a curious map of the capital city with its 12 gates, from a known author who took an exact survey of it in a dream. Considering the great care and pains of the author and the usefulness of the work, he hopes every one will be ready, for their own good as well as his, to contribute cheerfully to it, and not grudge him the profit he may have by it, especially if he comes to a 3rd or 4th edition, as he expects it will very soon. He doubts not but it will be translated into foreign languages by most nations of Europe, as well as Asia and Africa, being of as great use to all those nations as to his own. For this reason he designs to procure patents and privileges for securing the whole benefit to himself from all those different princes and states, and hopes to see many millions of this great work printed in those different countries and languages before his death. After this business is pretty well established, he has promised to put a friend on another project almost as good as this, by establishing insurance offices everywhere for securing people from shipwreck and several other accidents in their voyage to this country, and these officers shall furnish, at a certain rate, pilots well versed in the route, and know all the rocks, shelves, quicksands, etc., that such pilgrims and travellers may be exposed to. Of these he knows a great number ready instructed in most countries, but the whole scheme of this matter he is to draw up at large and communicate to his friend. End of Part 12. End of A Tale of a Tub by Jonathan Swift. Recorded by Edmund Bloxam